Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This is brought to you by Rex Bookstore. My name is Abigail Thea O. Canuto. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy of education at the UP College of Education. Today, we're going to talk about how important it is to stay connected despite the physical distance among us. And so, hopefully, we'll be able to establish how we're going to learn together through virtual communities of inquiry. So just an overview of our presentation, what we're going to talk about is first, togetherness despite the distance. Why is it important? So just a situationer, I believe Professor Zamora, Professor Ducapante, and Professor Binluan have already mentioned a lot about this when they delivered their webinars earlier this week. So very briefly, we're going to talk about what we're all going through right now, which is the pandemic. At ano po yung kanilang mga general implications sa ating safety and well-being. We're also going to talk about a familiar concept. I'm assuming a familiar concept to many of us teachers. That's collaborative learning. How can we possibly capitalize on collaborative learning and creating a community of learners so that we can be together despite the physical distance? I'm going to zero in on a pedagogy that we call the community of inquiry. Okay, so essentially what we do in the community of inquiry is we think things together. Okay, pakitandaan lang po muna iyon. Fundamentally, ang ginagawa po natin sa community of inquiry is two things. We ask questions, it's very important, and we engage in what we call dialogical inquiry. So I'm going to elaborate on that later on. Mas nagiging popular po ngayon yung mga pedagogies online because of how we're forced to deliver instruction remotely. So there are certain scholars such as Anderson and his associates who talk about how to cultivate virtual communities of inquiry. So on the second part, we're going to talk about the concept of community of inquiry as a pedagogy and how it is perhaps applied in face-to-face classroom. And then eventually talk about how to establish what we call virtual communities of inquiry. So, importante daw po na present itong tatlong elemento na ito. Okay? First, cognitive presence. Second, social presence. And finally, teaching presence. So, idedetalye po natin yan later on. Next, we're going to talk about some pedagogical issues that might make it difficult, challenging, for a lot of us to implement what we're talking about, what we're calling virtual communities of inquiry. So first, kahit na nung face-to-face tayo, na nagkikita siguro po, alam natin, bakit palaging kulang ang oras. So lack of time. Many of us have a lot of paperwork, have a lot of other priorities to do. Ganun din, kahit ngayong learning remotely, parang concern pa rin po natin yung lack of time. Another concern is peer culture. Okay, so ibig sabihin yung kultura ng mga estudyante themselves. So how do we go beyond that kind of culture? I'm going to talk about that later on. And finally, a need to adapt. We're familiar with the saying that, we are in a rapidly changing world and there is a constant need to adapt. Ngayon pa, meron tayong pandemic. Diba? What kind of situation it is that we need to adapt now, and how possibly can virtual communities of inquiry help us in that way? And finally, I'm going to talk about the teacher as facilitator. So narinig nyo na po ito. I'm assuming na familiar kayo sa term na facilitation or facilitator, to the extent that maybe, some of us think, naku, gas-gas na yan, ilang beses ko nang narinig yan. But we're going to operationalize the way that we're defining facilitation and facilitator in the context of the community of inquiry. So I'm going to draw insights from a paper I wrote a few years back based on my experience, my personal experience as a facilitator of communities of inquiry. So two things, essentially. I'm going to talk about some ideas of how to create a caring classroom, in quotes, because we're now talking about a virtual classroom, and what I call the teacher philosopher. Hopefully that's not an intimidating term, pero yun po yung tawag ko for specific reasons, which I'm going to talk about later on. Okay, So, first part, the pandemic and our safety and well-being. So I think it's a general truth that we can all relate to. You know, how the pandemic is a threat to all of us, to our lives in general. Siguro po iba't iba po yung epekto or nagiging epekto sa atin ng COVID-19. It is very sad. Some of us might know of certain people, family members, friends, who have actually passed on because of the virus. Siguro po meron sa atin nagkasakit, no, na ospital, o kaya hindi natin alam, baka asymptomatic. And some of us are fortunate enough to be surviving, you know, so far without having contracted the virus. In any case, naapektuhan tayo lahat kasi lalo na when we experienced community quarantine, hindi po ba na talagang stricto yung pag-implement nito. We've been having and we continue to have limited interactions. We can no longer meet with our colleagues, our students. We can no longer see our friends as often as we'd like. Not to mention the disrupted routines, hindi po ba? Hindi na natin maplano yung araw natin na katulad ng dati. And so many of us have found it very difficult to be productive at home. The lines between home and work life has been blurred. So that being said, what about the anxiety of the unknown? We don't know until when we will have to endure, observing all these protocols na talagang napaka-limiting po sa ating mga buhay. Hindi natin alam kung kailan tayo makakabalik sa normal. All of these things taken together can easily take their toll on our mental health. So, as teachers, alam po natin na we cannot make education wait forever. Diba? Kasi kawawa rin yung mga estudyante at the end of the day. This crisis has affected and will continue to affect us all. But I hope you agree with me, we will have to eventually adapt to these new circumstances. Kaya nga po tayo nag-uusap, in this way. May physical distance pero sinusubukan pa rin nating matuto at i-apply ito hopefully sa ating mga classrooms kasi kailangan nating mag-adapt. I hope you agree with me because I think we will have a greater chance at succeeding in adapting to these new circumstances if we forge a sense of belonging and connectedness despite the physical distance among us. Okay, so the question would of course be, how do we do that, considering how physically distanced we are? So collaborative learning, okay, is a common concept that I think marami po sa atin narinig na maaaring ginagawa na natin, pero just laying down the ground so that we can be sure that we can understand each other. When we say collaborative learning, it is characterized by students working towards a common goal. So it's where group members coordinate their cognitive, metacognitive, motivational, and emotional efforts. Now, how do they do that? Simply through an exchange of ideas, okay? In other words, importante sa collaborative learning that students and teacher talk to each other, okay? And that dominates a huge amount of class time. Studies have shown that through an active exchange of ideas, students actually manifest increased interest in whatever it is that they're learning, that it improves their thinking, and that it cultivates a more relaxed rather than a contrived atmosphere. Ang suma total daw po ng collaborative learning, kung ito ay successful, ay autonomous learning. Okay, so you have students who take ownership of their learning, who are responsible for the things that they learn. So collaborative learning is, the opposite of competitive learning. Instead of students engaging in competition against each other, nagtutulungan po sila. Okay? The thing is, like any other good idea, alam naman natin that an idea such as collaborative learning is so much easier said than done. May kanya-kanya po tayong konteksto, pero imagine na lang po natin how difficult it would be kung masyadong maraming estudyante, kung napakainit sa classroom, kung napakaraming trabaho ni teacher, etc. Kasi po yung ganitong klase ng learning, kinocultivate ito, hindi ito nangyayari automatically. So a simple implication could be that It doesn't mean that we ask students to collaborate. They will in fact collaborate, okay? And that's just some of the challenges to collaborative learning according to Hadwin and his associates. So according to them, successful regulation is not always observed, unfortunately, in group learning. It does not happen automatically. Why is that? Their speculation is that learners in groups do not always share common goals, plans, and strategies. So, ang sinasabi po nila, maaaring because of, students' personalities. Talagang they don't work well with other students, with their peers. Maaaring iba ang kanilang priorities. They don't see the benefit of working together. Okay? We'll address that in a while. Hindi po kasi ibig sabihin na ganun yung sitwasyon, wala na tayong magagawa. Siyempre, importante yung teacher intervention o yung tinatawag nating teacher facilitation. But even that can be problematic. It can be potentially problematic kasi po yung konsepto nga ng facilitation, katulad nung nabanggit ko kanina, is open for interpretation. It might mean different things for different teachers, and that's okay. Hindi naman po natin sinasabi na isa lang dapat ang definition niyan. Pero ang purpose po natin ngayong umaga is to operationalize how that term will apply to teaching or to facilitation in the community of inquiry. So I'm inviting you now to reflect on the following questions because they have implications to the meat of our discussion. Okay, so let's be honest with ourselves when we answer these questions. First, try to describe the typical scenario in your classroom, okay? In your own words, in whatever way you'd like. So first, what kind of talk typically takes place in your classroom? Ibig sabihin, paano nyo po i-describe yung uri, yung quality ng pag-uusap ng mga estudyante at ninyo pong mga teacher sa classroom? How much time do students talk in class? Sa loob ng isang oras, halimbawa, ilang minuto? 30 minutes? 45 minutes? Baka 5 minutes lang? What kinds of questions do you ask them? Open questions? Closed questions? Rhetorical questions that don't really have to be answered? What kind of questions? What do you do after students answer your questions? Do you move on to another student? Do you probe further, with that student kapag sumagot siya ng isang beses? And then what do you do after you probe once? Do you probe again further? Or do you move on to another student? And does it ever happen? Do students themselves ask difficult questions? And if they do, what happens then? What do we do? Do we say, homework nyo na yan? Or do we try to grapple with these questions real time, spontaneously? I also invite you to think about, to reflect on your thoughts about what you think happens to the way that we think. Yung sa isip natin. Anong nangyayari sa isip natin kapag nag-uusap tayo, when we talk to each other? What about when we are invited to think of other possibilities? Because when we talk to other people, and when we talk to them more and more, chances are we come to a point where we see, may iba pa palang maaaring sagot, may iba pa palang beliefs, may iba pa palang ideas. What does that do to our thinking? Does it challenge our thinking? Or does it shut down our thinking? What does it do to our thinking? What about when we are compelled to support our arguments? When we are asked questions like, paano mo nasabi? What's your evidence? What's your basis for saying such things? What about when we arrive at conflicting ideas? Life is so much easier when we all agree with each other, right? But what if we are confronted with students who don't agree with us? And what do you think happens to students' minds when they start to realize that not everyone in the class holds the ideas? What happens to our thinking when we become aware of our biases and our prejudices? And what happens to our thinking when we realize that we could in fact be wrong? Are we intellectually mature enough to change our minds in light of new and better evidence, for example? So these questions are all important. And again, they have implications in what we're going to talk about for the rest of the morning. And I'm asking them because I am struck by something that Francis Bacon said. Sabi niya po, who questions much shall learn much and retain much. So I think asking questions in the classroom and grappling, confronting these questions and trying to answer them together is very promising. Meron po siguro tayong I think it's a rich resource yung mismong tanong nila at pag-uusapan natin together. Palagay ko maraming matututunan po doon. So I'm proposing that we do it in the context of a community of inquiry where students and teacher think things together. So sa madaling salita po, kung ilalarawan ko lamang, ang community of inquiry, ito po ay isang group of individuals inquiring into a specific problem or issue. Okay, so that's simple enough. To sort of expound on that a bit, tinatawag po siyang community because if it is successfully established, again, it does not happen right away and it does not happen automatically. It takes a lot of work para ito mangyari, okay? But if it's successfully established, the community is a community because it is guided by one, harmony. So you don't see students competing with each other, debating with each other to see who wins. It is guided by a common interest. And eventually, students will find camaraderie in each other. It's a community of inquiry, on the other hand, because what students do is think, reason, and ask questions. So taken together, I hope it makes more sense now. What happens in a community of inquiry is the teacher, as well as the participants, the students, think together. What do they think together? So when I talk to teachers, different subject teachers about how to conduct a community of inquiry in their particular subject matter, minsan po halimbawa sa math, pinag-uusapan namin what are mathematical truths, yan, and why do formulae work that way. Yan. So it goes beyond, diba, the didactic lessons of, how do you execute a certain formula, halimbawa. Social studies naman, napaka-interesting pong pag-usapan halimbawa, anong ibig sabihin ng democracy and what does it mean to be a democratic citizens? What about culture? How does that influence, for example, our values and our morality? And what does it mean to be free? Okay, so it's very interesting, I think, to talk about these concepts in light, for example, of the lessons that we have in relation to them. In values education naman po, interesting yung mga naiisip ng mga estudyante tungkol sa mga konsepto ng values, ethics, and morality. Okay? And finally, in science, these are just examples, of course. But in science, students can ask questions like, what is our role in world ecology? And can science answer moral questions? So you now have an idea about the kind of questions that we ask in the community of inquiry. So in the community of inquiry, meron po tayong, we look out, okay? We look out for certain kinds of questions, okay? So it's important, it's useful, I think, for our purposes to understand that there are many different kinds of questions and many different ways by which we can treat them, okay? So sabi po ni Philip Cam, meron daw siyang tinatawag na closed textual questions. Okay, first, ang closed textual question po ay yung mga questions whose answers can be found in your own material. Pag sinabi nating material, pwede pong yung lesson ninyo o kaya textbook or kung ano man pong reference material. So pag binasa yun ng estudyante, masasagot niya yung tanong na closed textual. Okay? On the other hand, meron din po tayong tinatawag na open textual questions. These are questions where students can use their imagination to answer these questions, okay? So based pa rin po siya doon sa reference material, pero pwede nilang pag-isipan by themselves ano yung mai-infer ko halimbawa tungkol sa napag-aralan ko, okay? Ito pong mga closed at open textual questions, these are I think the more familiar kinds of questions that we encounter or even ask our students in the classroom. Third, meron pong tinatawag na closed intellectual questions. Okay? So these are ask an expert questions. These are answers that we can find in books, websites, etc., or even a resource person. I'll give you an example later on. And then finally, ito po yung mga questions na nagpapabuhay na sa community of inquiry. These are what we call open intellectual questions. These are need to discuss questions. Why do we need to discuss them? Because they don't have only one answer. So kanina po nabanggit ko, there are many different ways by which we can treat kung paano natin tatratuhin ang tanong. So hindi po kasi automatic na iti-treat natin na open intellectual ang isang tanong. May mga teachers po or kahit mga magulang, halimbawa, na kung minsan pwede naman na open intellectual ang question pero tinatrato siyang closed question para hindi na masyadong mahaba ang usapan. Halimbawa, basta ganon, basta yun ang sagot or basta ganito ang paliwanag dyan dahil sinabi ko as an authority. Yun po, that's potentially open intellectual question po sana siya pero tinitreat natin siya na closed question. Okay? So, in the context of, what we're going through in this pandemic, it can possibly be a teaching moment. Halimbawa po, kapag yung estudyante nagtanong siya ng, "Teacher, bakit hindi pa rin tayo pwedeng bumalik sa school?" Maaari po sigurong closed textual question siya kasi halimbawa pwede nating tingnan ano ba ang sinasabi ng WHO tungkol dito o ni President Duterte o kaya ng DepEd. Bakit hindi pa rin tayo pwedeng bumalik sa school? In other words, merong objective na sagot para sa kanya. May mga tanong naman halimbawa, at sa simula po ng community of inquiry, teachers muna ang magtatanong. Ano sa palagay nyo ang mangyayari kung bumalik na tayo ngayon sa school? So see how it asks students to hypothesize, to conceptualize, and to imagine possible answers to the question. Maaaring may ready answer na ang teacher kung anong mangyayari kung babalik na tayo sa school. But why are we providing this opportunity for students? We're providing this opportunity for students kasi po, kung hindi natin gagawin yon, their thinking will not improve. The opportunity to think together will be deprived of them. Okay, so I hope you can better follow my drift now. Ang tanong naman po na katulad ng gaano kadelikado ang magkaroon ng virus na ito is quite, specific. At tinatawag po natin ito, at least in this particular context, na closed intellectual question kasi pwede na tayong kumonsulta halimbawa sa sinasabi ng mga scientists kung gaano nga ba kadelikado ang magkaroon ng virus na ito. Pwede nating tingnan ang sinasabi ng statistics, ng data na available. Need to discuss questions naman. Ang halimbawa ay paanong pagmamalasakit sa kapwa ang pag-iingat na hindi ako magkasakit o makahawa. So again, pwede po tayong magmadali at sabihin sa kanila, kasi ganito, di ba? Kawawa naman yung mga hawa nating matatanda, for example. While tama naman yung sinasabi natin sa kanila, again, if we don't treat the question as an open intellectual question, then we're depriving them of the opportunity to think together. Okay, so hopefully that helps illustrate, the different kinds of questions that could possibly be asked by the teacher and the students and how we can treat them in this different ways. So, ang objective po ng community of inquiry ay makapag-dialogue. Okay, yung tinatawag nating dialogical inquiry na nabanggit ko po kanina doon sa ating outline. So, hindi rin po yun nangyayari automatically. Merong you remember I asked you earlier what kind of talk typically happens in your classroom kasi may iba't iba pong uri. Okay, Lippmann helps us distinguish among three kinds. First is discussion. And this is, I think, what is most familiar to us. Okay, ito yung tinatawag natin na class discussion, kung saan ang mga estudyante at ang teacher ay nag-uusap. Okay? Nag-uusap lang, discussion. Expressing ideas and the boundaries are clearer. Ito po yung, kung may tanong man ang teacher, may sasagot na isang estudyante, pero hindi na ipoproblematize or ipoprobe pa yung sagot ng estudyante, mag-move on na po sa ibang estudyante na. Okay, so what happens is, kahit na marami ang nagsalita, hiwa-hiwala yung ideas. They don't build upon each other. I hope you can understand what I mean. Sometimes when the teacher starts to problematize itong mga opinion ng mga estudyante, they start to take sides, okay? So nagkakaroon po ng debate. The thing about debate is, while it does also promise to develop, analytical skills, critical thinking skills, it's by nature competitive. So what happens is students start to think in polarities. Okay, they start to take sides just for the sake of it, right? And they argue in order to debunk. So it is important in a debate that you win. So competitive po siya. Di ba, sabi nga natin, ang collaborative learning is non-competitive. So debate is also not what we're looking for in a communicative inquiry. So as I mentioned, ang sinusubukan po nating magawa sa communicative inquiry ay yung tinatawag nating dialogue. Okay? So it's collaborative, it's thinking together, and it's focused towards a forward movement. So one of the indicators of a community of inquiry is when the students start to follow a specific logic, a specific path of logic. Okay? At sama-sama na silang pinag-iisipan yung pinag-uusapan kahit na isa, dalawa, tatlo, apat, lima lang sa kanila yung nagsasalita. The rest of the students are thinking together along with them. Ito po medyo technical ang terminologies and you don't have to, please don't, memorize them. Okay, you can always look them up. But I'm sharing them with you now just so I can illustrate to you further what typically happens in a communicative inquiry. Kasi the thing po about communicative inquiry, I keep mentioning it, that it does not develop automatically. And the rate and characteristic by which it develops vary from one class, from one community to another. Okay? Pero sa observation ko po, dahil kahit po sa higher education, where I'm teaching, ganun din po ako magturo. Sa simula po talaga makikita ninyo na anecdotal pa lang. Okay? Ibig sabihin ng anecdotal, unstructured pa lang yung discussion. So ito po yung tinatawag nating discussion kanina. Nag-uusap pa lang yung mga estudyante, nag-share lang sila. Well, share ko lang, parang ganon. Nagkikwento lang sila based sa kanilang personal experiences. But they don't yet reflect critically on their experiences. Okay? A little while after that, kapag nagsa-start na pong mag-develop yung community of inquiry, nagiging na siyang monological. Ito po yung, they still are not very much reflective about what they say, but they're more active now. Okay? They're more active now. Hindi mo na sila kailangang pilitin masyado or i-encourage masyado. They're more active now in speaking up. Okay? And that's good, but not yet a community of inquiry, not yet dialogical. The true beginnings of a community of inquiry can be observed in a non-critical dialogical type of verbal exchange. So dito po, talagang very active pa din ang role ng facilitator. The facilitator keeps on explicating explanations of students. Madalas dito sinasabi pa ng teacher, pag sinabi mo bang ganito, ganito rin ang ibig mong sabihin. Paano mo nasabi yan? Mga ganong klase po ng tanong that helps students think further about what they initially said. Okay? Kasi hindi pa nga po internalized ng estudyante. So, hindi pa automatic sa kanila na mas malalim na pag-isipan yung kani-kanilang mga opinion. Later on, and this is where the facilitator can start to relinquish control. Yung babawasan na po nila yung kanilang active facilitation kasi medyo nasasanay na yung mga estudyante. At ma-observe nyo to. Paano? This is where students now start to justify what it is that they're saying without the teacher asking them. Okay, so it's a good sign that you're already on the semi-critical dialogical stage. So students are becoming more and more interdependent, although the influence is not enough to modify the whole group's perspective. Meron dyan pa rin mga magsasabi, basta ito ang opinion ko, hindi ko babaguhin. So it's part of the process. Finally, the highest level is what Daniel and Daniel et al. Call critical dialogical. Ito na po yung critical inquiry and explicit interdependence. Ito po yung kapag umabot po kayo dito, hindi na talaga tayo masyadong nagfa-facilitate, so to speak, yung talagang active na nagtatawag pa ng estudyante. Mas active na ito, mas spontaneous na yung kanilang pag-uusap. Okay? So, I hope that helps illustrate the typical process that happens when we're trying to cultivate communities of inquiry. So now the question of how do we now cultivate virtual communities of inquiry? So, ito po yung framework, ano, it's a bit, it looks a bit complicated with all the texts, but basically at the center of it is our educational experience. Okay, so I hope you can see there the 3 elements, which I'm going to discuss in further detail. Iyon pong social presence, which is engaging with participants. Cognitive presence, which is engaging with content, o yung pong, yung mga lessons natin. And social presence and cognitive presence support, the discourse that's happening. Yung teaching presence po, ito na yung facilitation. Ito yung nasa pinakailalim ng inner circle. Ito po yung pag-engage sa mga estudyante towards our disciplinal goals at yung direction po ng dialogue na tinatahak natin. Okay, so kailangan with teaching presence, masiset na yung climate for social presence. I'll explain further later on. And it will, the teacher, because of his or her expertise in subject matter, will regulate learning. Okay, so surrounding that would be the applications used, mga Zoom halimbawa, communication medium, educational context, at saka yung discipline standards. Okay, so himayin na po natin. The first element of a community of inquiry, like teaching and cognitive presence, social presence is interdependent with the rest of the elements. Ibig pong sabihin, hindi pwedeng wala ang isa. Kailangan lahat po sila present sufficiently. Okay? Sufficiently present po dapat itong 3 elemento na ito para maging successful ang virtual communities of inquiry. Okay, so what is social presence? According to Garrison and Arbo, it is the ability of learners to project themselves socially and emotionally virtually. Okay? It leads to increased satisfaction if it's present sufficiently with both the learning process and the medium. Kasi siguro ngayon po, hindi komportable yung mga estudyante to be using all these alternative modes. They don't feel like it's their same self, kumbaga. Pero pag umabot po tayo doon sa ganong klase ng social presence, sa talagang nakaka-identify na tayo doon sa mga ginagamit nating alternative modes, it will lead to increased satisfaction with both the learning process and the medium. So, as I mentioned, all of these presences are necessary for each other's development. So I'll illustrate later on how the third point rings true. So social presence is characterized by first, open communication. Ito yung hindi na natatakot mag-express ng kanilang mga tanong at ideas ang mga participants. Group cohesion, collaborative na sila. Affective expression, syempre po halimbawa lang ito, pero ang sinasabi po ng literature, magandang indication daw na emotionally present at emotionally invested ang mga estudyante when they often use, emoticons. So open communication is when the group feels secure enough to communicate openly that they coalesce around a common goal or purpose. So again, what we have to understand is that this does not happen automatically. It takes time for this to actually happen. Group cohesion, on the other hand, is when students now have intellectual focus. Ito yung may sinusundan na silang logical path and respect, cognitive respect towards one another. Affective expression, on the other hand, happens when participants have found affinity in the group. Ito na yung camaraderie po natin sinasabi. Okay, so it does not automatically happen. It takes work. The teacher is the very first model of all of these things. So kailangan po talaga yung teaching presence, as I will later show. So meron pong useful tips for developing social presence from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Pero sa opinion ko po, kasi hindi naman explicitly yung sinasabi, sa opinion ko po, the way that I understand these tips, mas tips po sila kapag nagsisimula pa lang tayong mag-cultivate ng virtual communities of inquiry. Okay? Halimbawa po, ina-advise ang teachers na gumawa ng isang discussion forum. Tapos tayo rin, we let ourselves become somewhat vulnerable by sharing some personal information that of course we're comfortable sharing, and also encouraging our class, our students, to provide similar materials to the extent that they feel comfortable doing so. So basic naman, addressing class participants in the discussion by name, and personalizing course introductions and announcements with audio or video when possible. So again, parang mas applicable po ito sa simula, okay? When we're trying to establish pa lang the community of inquiry. According to Brown, meron pong typical process ang pag-e-establish ng social presence. So it will first begin with online acquaintances, and we know when we say acquaintance, para pong na-meet mo lang, hindi ba? Hindi pa kayo talaga magkaibigan, wala pa talaga kayong investment kumbaga sa isa't isa. So ganun din po yung virtual community of inquiry. Magsisimula din po siya muna sa online acquaintances. Later on, magkakaroon na ng conferment. So, may identification na sila. Magkaklase tayo. Meron tayong, relationship kahit hindi pa ganoon kalalim. Eventually, camaraderie. Okay? So, ito po yung talagang they belong. Belongingness has been cultivated, and a sense of connectedness has been cultivated in the virtual community of inquiry. Wala pong sinasabi si Brown at yung iba pang scholars tungkol sa kung gaano katagal ang kailangan. Okay? Pero I would say let's give it, if we're meeting online, let's say, twice a week? Kung twice a week po siguro, in a month, medyo may conferment na siguro. Ganyan. Pero ang camaraderie po medyo matagal yan, pwedeng 3 months yan minimum. So what we have to remember about social presence is that if it's sufficiently established, it builds a climate of trust and environment of comfort and safe risk-taking. This foundation, therefore, makes the learners ready for your teaching presence and cognitive presence. So ito po yung pinaka-prerequisite, kumbaga. Mahirap i-establish ang cognitive presence at saka ang teaching presence, ang hirap niyang gumana kung wala yung social part. Kung hindi, halimbawa, walang tiwala sa atin yung mga estudyante natin, hindi sila comfortable, being online, or hindi natin nagawa ng paraan yung kanilang differences in personalities that they tend to work competitively. So, kailangan po ma-address natin yun at ma-establish natin ang social presence. Cognitive presence, on the other hand, according to Garrison and Arbo, is the extent to which learners are able to construct and confirm meaning through sustained reflection and discourse. So keywords po, sustained reflection and discourse. Okay. The intended outcome of cognitive presence is critical thinking. I think I've been mentioning that early on also. According to literature, it's the most difficult to develop in online courses. And I think kahit po sa face-to-face classes, critical thinking is quite difficult to develop. So, meron po mga conditions na required the present para magkaroon ng cognitive presence. First, a triggering event or a sense of puzzlement. So, I think many teachers know, kung wala tayong moment na nalilito or nakakapagtaka, walang learning, hindi po ba? Dahil kung hindi tayo nagtataka, ibig sabihin, hindi tayo interesado o kaya po, alam na natin yon. So, kailangan merong triggering event that will be introduced. In the beginning, it's the teacher that does that provides the triggering event para maging interesado at magtaka ang mga estudyante. But later on, sila na rin can be based on their personal experiences. But as we go along, especially if we're really facilitating effectively, when students exchange information, they also look for valid, okay, information. Hindi lang sila huhugot ng kung anong information kung saan-saan. So alam nila na may disiplina yung pakikipag-dialogue sa isa't isa. They take responsibility for their learning. Integration now is where we connect ideas. So as a facilitator, dinedemand po tayo na maging mahusay dito sa pag-connect ng ideas na ito. Kasi students can't do that on their own. Perhaps eventually they can learn how to do it as you keep on modeling it, but it's important that you know how to do this. Kaya dapat sharp po yung tenga natin doon sa mga ideas na sinasabi nila, kasi may mga similarities and differences yon na hindi sila aware or hindi nila i-articulate. So tayo po ang mag-identify nun para sa kanila. It's sort of dealing with ideas as they spontaneously come and organizing it for students so that they understand everything that's going on. Kasi masakit po talaga sa ulo ang dialogue. Kasi ang daming ideas, kailangan organize yon at the end of the day para sa kanila. Finally, resolution. It's the application of new ideas. So when we talk of resolution, we also don't necessarily mean that we expect students to converge only on one answer or only on one conclusion, especially when it's an it's an answer to an open intellectual question. Hope you understand what I mean. When we say application of new ideas also, we don't mean talagang, ini-expect natin at the end of a class, of a semester, they will go out there and actually apply in practice. Kahit po yung pag-apply ng ideas sa dialogue pa lang, kino-consider na po natin yun na application. Ibig sabihin kapag halimbawang naka-apekto yung dialogue sa magiging conclusions nila later on, application na po yun ng ideas when it has caused some paradigm shift or shift in their existing ideas and beliefs, halimbawa. Or renewal. Hindi naman po kailangan palaging magbago ang ideas or beliefs. So again, tips for developing cognitive presence, lalo na po sa simula ng community of inquiry. Students should ask learners to identify their learning goals for the course. So sa simula pa lang, alam na dapat po ng mga estudyante na may say sila sa mga ganitong bagay. Well, at the same time, we as teachers set reasonable expectations for student inquiry. Siguro po i-emphasize ko lang po dito yung reasonable, but also, hindi naman po natin bababaan yung ating expectations. Diba? Kasi lugi din sila doon. Ang expectations naman natin ay para din sa kanila. Hindi po ba? Another tip for developing cognitive presence is examining, challenging, and probing student responses, thereby encouraging analysis of ideas. So, nabanggit ko na po ito kanina. Isa pa po, developing learning activities that are relevant, challenging, collaborative, engaging, and require deep thinking. Sige po. So, we should remember about cognitive presence is the following. It includes activities developed and actions taken to encourage students to explore their ideas, their thoughts, and beliefs to meaningfully connect with the content and facilitate learning. So, again, ito po yung process naman ng establishing cognitive presence. All the elements have to be present. A triggering event that will lead to an exploration, to integration, and finally to a resolution. So this is what I've already discussed just briefly a while ago. Now, teaching presence, ito na po yung magtatahi, kumbaga. It will tie together the cognitive presence and the social presence. It's the design, facilitation, and direction of cognitive and social processes for the purpose of realizing personally meaningful and educationally worthwhile learning outcomes. Okay? Ito po ay ang lahat ng ginagawa ng teacher para mag-guide, ma-support, at ma-shape ang mga experiences ng learners. So lahat ng kanyang teaching na ginagawa sa community of inquiry, that is teaching presence. So how do we establish teaching presence? First, through instructional design and organization. And all of us teachers are trained to do this, diba? But siguro, it's useful to point out, especially because we're now learning remotely, we should be more explicit and transparent regarding them. Okay? Kasi iba po talaga yung sitwasyon eh. Dapat sure tayo na naiintindihan ng mga estudyante what are expected of them. In facilitating this course, marami na po akong nabanggit kanina. So some of that will entail us to review and comment upon student responses. So again, very careful tayo sa ating pakikinig. To raise questions kapag hindi po masyado nagtatanong ang mga estudyante. At ganun po talaga sa simula. To move discussions in a desired direction, not to manipulate the discussion in a direction that we like. Yung parang yung conclusion ko, dapat conclusion din nila. Hindi po, ibig sabihin ng desired direction, ito yung making sure that discussion moves efficiently and nasasagasaan natin yung content natin, yung dapat nating ituro talaga as subject teachers. It also involves drawing out inactive students. Iba-iba po ang philosophy ng mga facilitators. Diba? I have facilitator colleagues and friends that are more talented, I think, are more able in drawing out inactive students. Ako po kasi siguro dahil hindi rin ako masyadong nagsasalita, when I was a student, pero marami akong natutunan. I'm thinking, hindi naman kailangan palaging magsalita yung students all the time. Sometimes I look at them, nakikiramdam ako kung ready na ba silang magsalita, but I also make them feel na wala pong pilitan. That if they're ready, once they're ready, I believe they will speak up as long as they feel that the social presence is there, that they can take risks, and it's all right if I take my time na makikinig lang muna ako. It's also the teacher's job to limit the activities of dominating posters. Pag sila lang yung mga nagsasalita or sila lang yung mga nagpo-post, halimbawa. But only when it's already detrimental to the learning of the rest of the class. So, tinitimpla po ito pinakikiramdaman. Walang hard and fast rule tungkol sa mga bagay na ito. As facilitators, it's also our job to help students share meaning, to identify areas of agreement and disagreement, and to seek to reach consensus and understanding. Direct instruction naman is still part of teaching presence kasi meron tayong mga expertise, hindi po ba? Ito yung ating intellectual and scholarly leadership. Okay? When we present content, we do it, somewhat didactically, pero ang objective ng didactic at direct instruction pa rin is to facilitate reflection. Mapapaisip pa rin sila. At pag napaisip sila, iyon na po yung triggering event, pwede na and so forth. Okay, it's also a way for us to provide feedback. So dito po, dapat, syempre, dahil expert tayo sa ating subject matter, alam natin kapag katama ba yung information or yung understanding nila. So, it's our job to inject sources of information, okay, kapag katama yung moment, and to direct discussion in useful directions, okay? Because there's little point talking about, halimbawa, something like the pandemic, the virus, when walang masyado, false ang information halimbawa na nagsisirculate doon sa community of inquiry. So, trabaho din natin na make sure na accurate yung information. Hindi problematic yung information na nagsisirculate sa community. Okay? So, alam na po ninyo ito, to scaffold the learner knowledge to raise it to a new level. So, ulit lang po, ito po yung ating framework. Pwede po natin siyang i-look up at balikan later on. So, we're nearing towards the end of the presentation. Kasi the meat really is talking about the theory and pedagogy of the community of inquiry. But I think, to be fair, it's not an easy pedagogy. And there is, like with any other teaching strategy, ang dami po nating pedagogical issues. Isa po doon, yung kultura po, at hindi lang ito specific sa atin, okay, in the Philippine educational system. Pero marami pong nakakapag-observe na mga scholars how education is commonly regarded as the transfer of knowledge from those who know to those who don't know. And if you've been following my lecture very carefully, alam naman natin, hindi ganun yung philosophy ng community of inquiry. So, may fundamental change na kailangang mangyari doon sa pag-iisip natin na, basta ang trabaho ko as a teacher, i-regurgitate yung aking alam, papunta sa mga estudyante na hindi pa alam yung alam ko. So, ang sabi nila, pag daw sa simula, di ba, pag bata pa yung mga estudyante, mga kindergarten pa lang, okay lang kahit matanong sila, cute naman eh. Or talagang hindi pa tayo masyadong seryoso sa kanilang learning ng content. No? Mas maraming play, halimbawa, as if play is not significant in children's learning. Pero may mga nagsasabi na we allow students to talk about their opinions, their ideas, and their questions more freely the younger they are. But then as they grow up, dahil nga napaka-traditional ng philosophy ng maraming teachers at maraming schools at maraming educational systems, by the time students reach 4th or 5th grade, nagiging passive na raw sila, incurious, uncritical, and thoughtless, which I think is quite unfortunate. So ang nangyayari po, students then believe that they cannot think on their own, na kailangan nila tayo palagi to think for them. And that's not scaffolding, di ba po? Alam naman natin as teachers kung anong ibig sabihin noon. Gusto nating i-equip yung mga estudyante na makapag-isip at i-facilitate sila sa simula para dadating po yung panahon that they can do it on their own. So, this is something that a lot of teachers and even parents agree with. Students are growing up in a world increasingly flooded with information. Change is often rapid and unpredictable, and there is a constant need to adapt. So how does the community of inquiry help us adapt? Dagdagan pa natin yung pressure sa teachers, hindi po ba to cover an impossibly large amount of content and to prepare students for standardized testing. Ang community of inquiry po, hindi para doon. So sabi nila, wala na talaga akong panahon dyan. At hindi natin masisisi ang teachers doon. Kaya lang po kung babalikan natin yung unang sinabi and you can't, and you agree with me, paano nga po yan, kailangan din nating kapitalan yung social relationships natin with our students because it's very difficult to adapt to these new circumstances if we feel isolated and if we feel alone. So what the community of inquiry asks us to do is to provide space to discuss what our problems are and what we need to do about them. To expound on that, the space that needs to be provided is one where students and teachers can ask one another questions about what they're going through, to share their thoughts and feelings with each other, not just because it is potentially therapeutic. Dahil therapeutic po talaga yan. We will feel better when we share our thoughts and feelings, but that is not the only objective of the community of inquiry. But because it is a way to build trust, forge camaraderie, and think and act as a community. So the teacher as facilitator. We've been talking about the characteristics of a facilitator for the past hour. We've also been discussing how or what specific ways by which the teacher can facilitate communities of inquiry. So I'm just going to focus on what a caring classroom is. Okay, so these are my personal insights based on my own experience as a facilitator of communities of inquiry. So first, I think it helps a lot if we have a bird's eye view, which means what? So laying the ground first po talaga, no? Making students feel welcome and safe, first and foremost. Second, cultivating trust, respect, and fairness in class. So I mentioned earlier, tayo po ang pinaka-model nito. Kapag tayo mismo cannot be trusted, we can't, halimbawa, hindi tayo masyadong tumatawa, we don't smile that often, or we don't maintain eye contact. It's difficult, diba, to establish a teaching presence in that way, and it's difficult for students to be interested in getting to know us, and vice versa. So dapat tayo mismo could establish these things first and foremost. That we also give each and every idea a fair hearing. Ang dami po kasi nitong implications, halimbawa, with the way that we deal with questions, the way that we react spontaneously to certain opinions. Nata-turn off po ang estudyante kapag nakikita nila kagad na may your biases are very strong, that it could be unfair to them when they disagree with you. Nararamdaman din ng estudyante if they're being ridiculed by the teacher or by their classmates. And when that happens, what does the teacher do kapag halimbawang nare-ridicule ang isang estudyante dahil sa kanyang sinabi? So tayo mismo ang pinakaunang model niyan. When we tolerate intolerance in the classroom, halimbawa, hindi nila yun nakakalimutan. And they retreat. Okay? They don't become willing anymore to invest further in the community that you're trying to build. So in the community of inquiry, we are providing students with a certain degree of freedom to think and to talk. But we're still a figure of authority, especially with regard to reminding students to treat each other with respect, to introducing materials and activities appropriate to their age, for example, and are worthy for classroom dialogue. Authority din po tayo when we direct the procedures for classroom management. Minsan talagang wala ng oras and we have to end for now. Minsan naman, alam natin, halimbawa when students are no longer coherent, kasi pagod na sila. So tayo rin naman yung may authority to wrap up, synthesize, and continue for another day. Importante din po for a facilitator to have what I call a keen intuition. Kasi nakikiramdam ka sa kanila eh. And all these things happen spontaneously in a community of inquiry. So what does a keen intuition mean? Lalo na po sa simula, when we are teaching students for the first time and we don't know them yet, di pa natin sila masyadong kilala, it's difficult. The difficulty in facilitation lies when it's difficult for us to get where they're coming from, or to sense what kind of point it is that they're trying to make. Kasi nga hindi pa natin sila masyadong kilala. So the implication of that would be, given time, eventually, mas makikilala natin sila, mas mauunawaan na natin kung saan sila nanggagaling, and therefore, mas madali na pong mag-facilitate. Isa po yun. Isa pa po, meron silang particular sensibilities and imaginations. May mga ways of thinking talaga itong mga estudyante natin na nalalaman lang natin as we keep on listening to them. Okay? So it's important to have those little notes in your mind. It's really difficult to facilitate, hindi po ba? We should also detect or feel readiness and reluctance. And by the way, if all of these things parang make it seem like it's so difficult to do facilitation, don't worry too much about it. We will always make mistakes anyway, pero yung mistakes natin, we reflect upon them and we try our best not to do them again. Kasi po ang facilitation ay talagang learning by doing. I always tell my students, those who ask me about how to facilitate, learning by doing yan eh. Hindi ka talaga matututo kung hindi mo ma-realize na dapat pala ito siguro yung ginawa ko, or I think that it's better this way if I were to expound on a student response in this particular manner, ng ganyan. Pero yung detecting or feeling readiness or reluctance po, yun nga, yung nabanggit ko kanina, isusubukan mo makipag-eye contact sa isang estudyante, tapos minsan titingin din siya sa'yo, makikiramdam din siya kung ready na ba siya. Mga ganun pong bagay, it helps a lot. Okay, without pressuring students, of course, without making them feel na mababa grade mo pag hindi ka nagsalita. Because in the community of inquiry, kapag na-establish po ang social presence, students will no longer care about, primarily, na kailangan magsalita ako for class participation grade. Mabuti yun, wala pong problema doon. Pero kapag ganun lang po kasi ang concern, hindi talaga siya collaborative, kundi competitive siya, na iniiwasan nga po natin. As a facilitator, we should also make reasonable and tentative predictions where the dialogue may be heading. So, pag masyado po tayong nagpe-predict at malayo tayo sa kung ano lang naman talaga yung sinabi ng estudyante, ang maaaring consequence po nun ay nauunahan na natin sila sa conclusion. Na hindi naman sana yun ang kanilang direksyon, parang kumbaga na-curtail na yung proseso nila na mag-isip pa. Minadali natin masyado. Parang ganun po. Pero, importante din na medyo a few steps ahead tayo dun sa mga estudyante para po meron tayong ina-anticipate na posibleng puntahan. Kasi kapag po tayo ay kasabay lang ng estudyante sa kanilang sinasabi, hindi po natin maida-direct yung discussion towards a logical path. Okay? I hope that illustrates that effectively, at least to some extent. Syempre po, kailangan committed din tayo sa inquiry. Okay? What does that mean? Continuously modeling critical thinking skills and attitudes or dispositions. Tayo nga po ang pinakaunang model ng lahat ng ito. We should be able to supervise the development of the community, and that's why I took time to talk about yung mga types of verbal exchanges na nabanggit ko kanina, kasi dapat alam natin kung anong klaseng facilitation na yung gagawin natin, kasi may mga pagbabago po yan as we go along. We should also be able to reduce or eliminate alienation among the participants. One good indicator na nagiging community of inquiry na po kayo, kapag halimbawa may estudyanteng nagsalita at yung opinion niya ay na sinishare niya ay taliwas doon sa na-express na opinion ng marami. Ibig pong sabihin nun, nararamdaman ng estudyante na yun na safe na magsalita kahit na mukhang mag-isa lang ako sa opinion na ito. I still belong in the community. So that's a good indicator po. So ibig sabihin nun, as a facilitator, you're effectively reducing or eliminating alienation among the participants. So I coined a term, the teacher philosopher. That's Socrates, by the way, just in case you're wondering. So I'm not saying that we're going to be a perfect model of being curious, open-minded, and respectful of students, but we always try our best to be so. Okay, so be genuinely curious, open-minded, and respectful of students as legitimate sources of questions and ideas, and as constructors of knowledge. So, tinatawag ko po siyang teacher philosopher dahil ang facilitator po ng community of inquiry ay talagang merong love of wisdom, at yun po naman talaga ay central sa philosophy. Ibig sabihin, na-enjoy niya rin dapat yung pagfa-facilitate kahit na napakahirap nito. Kasi yun lang po yung paraan para ma-embrace na yung challenges ng facilitation at hindi niya ito sukuan kahit na napakahirap po niyang gawin. Parang teaching lang po, hindi ba? Napakahirap gawin pero hindi sinusukuan. So, we're on our final points now. According to Garrison, these are the following things that we have to remember. First, sustained development and progression through the inquiry cycle requires well-designed learning activities, facilitation, and direction. Second, understanding the role of social presence is essential in creating a community of inquiry and in designing, facilitating, and directing higher order thinking. So, ito higher order learning. So, ito po yung sinasabi natin kanina na kapag wala ang social presence, which is the prerequisite for cognitive and teaching presence, wala na pong pag-asa yung dalawa. Okay, so it's very important that we're able to cultivate that first and foremost, and then later on, simultaneously with cognitive presence and teaching presence. Balancing social-emotional interaction, building group cohesion, and facilitating and modeling respectful critical discourse is essential for productive inquiry. Finally, emerging research suggests that there should be a complementary relationship between teaching presence and cognitive presence. Social presence, again, lays the groundwork for higher level discourse that will eventually help students develop social-emotional skills for decision-making, and the structure, organization, and leadership associated with teaching presence creates the environment where cognitive presence can be developed. So these are my references. I encourage you to look at some of them, if not all of them, and together we will get through this. So that ends my talk today. I'm ready now for your questions. Thank you very much for your time. Okay, so I have some questions sent via Viber from Grace Esguerra. How can you help children with up-to-date knowledge with no means to virtual community? Iba na pong paraan ito. Hindi na po siya saklaw ng virtual communities of inquiry because as I said, yung virtual communities of inquiry po, nakakontextualize po siya sa remote learning but virtually. So, sa pagkakaalam ko po, DepEd, for example, makes possible this particular thing that you're talking about where matututo pa rin yung bata through specific activities na hindi nangangailangan ng online. Nabasa ko po sa articles na sinasabi rin that DepEd will print, materials for students kung halimbawang walang access ang mga estudyante or wala silang resources para dito. Pero siguro po, lilinawin natin, hindi na po siya magiging saklaw ng virtual communities of inquiry. Ito pong katanungan ni Ma'am Grace kasi po nakakontextualize po tayo doon sa virtual communities of inquiry. Another question po from Lane Chicano. Good morning. Good morning din po. In discussion, sometimes I let someone to answer the question of their classmate. Is that okay? Most definitely po. Actually, sa community of inquiry, yun po talaga yung sinusubukan nating gawin. Okay, so we even encourage students to address one another spontaneously. So, minsan po, ang nangyayari kasi, may magtatanong na estudyante, ibabato sa akin, tapos ang gusto nilang gawin, ibato ko sa isa pang estudyante. So, kapag po ganun yung nangyayari, sinasabi ko po sa kanila, you talk directly to the person whom you're referring to or kung sino yung gusto mong tanungin. Sa simula po, talagang hindi pa sila masyadong comfortable doon sa konsepto na magbabatuhan sila ng tanong and they're independently doing it. So talagang dumadaan pa muna po sa akin. But eventually, minsan nga hindi na nila ako napapansin. They will just refer to me when they're talking about, objective information, yung alam nila na expertise ko. Pero kapag dating sa mga opinion or ideas o anong palagay nila, mabilis na po silang magbalitaktakan eventually. So yes, definitely, in-encourage po natin na yung mga estudyante, they try to answer their classmates' questions first. Tapos we inject sources of information as needed. Okay po. Another question is from Mami Yet. Ma'am, papaano po ang pag-handle ng discussion pag marami po ang students sa isang online classes? Thank you po. It's a very good question and it's also a concern kapag face-to-face. Okay. Kasi po yung sinasabi natin halimbawang community of inquiry, for example, it works best with a relatively small teacher-student ratio. To be fair, siguro naman may uunawaan natin, lahat naman ng teaching strategies would work better kung maliit ang teacher-student ratio. So talagang may problema tayo, I think, doon sa malalaki talagang classes. It's a fundamental problem talaga na sana masolusyonan natin. Pero ang aming recommendation po sa ganun, yung tinatawag na fishbowl technique, kung saan at a time, may mas maliit na grupong co-community of inquiry, observers lang po muna yung nasa labas ng fishbowl. Tapos magpapalit naman po sila ng roles later on. But that's in a face-to-face classroom. Pwede rin po sigurong i-apply ang konsepto ng fishbowl, community of inquiry virtually, na halimbawa, mag-a-assign lang po tayo ng members of the class, students in a particular class, siguro 15 to 20 at a time, na sila muna yung members ng community of inquiry, strictly speaking, on that particular day, pero naka-require po na nag-o-observe po yung iba. Okay? Pagkatapos po nun, we can meet them as a class and talk about what happened in the community of inquiry. Anong na-observe niyo sa mga kaklase niyo kasama sa virtual community of inquiry for that day? After a while, ibang grupo naman po, on another day naman yung mag-uusap-usap. Maganda po na kahit po nagpapalit tayo ng mga estudyante on a particular day, nare-relate pa rin nila yung pinag-uusapan nila doon sa pinag-usapan ng isang grupo. So para pa rin silang, I hope you can get what I mean, ano? Parang pare-pareho pa rin po silang kasama sa isang group lamang, although they're not in the small group at the same time. Okay, so yun po ang isang suggestion, typical suggestion that we have for big classes. Another question po from, excuse me, Rossini Urbano de Malata. How to keep up students' interest now that we are in remote learning? Ang argument po ng community of inquiry is when we allow students to share their thoughts and ask their own questions. That's already an interesting thing, for them. Sa simula po, matatakot pa sila. And don't get me wrong, even my college and even my master students would feel uncomfortable, being asked kung may mga tanong ba kayo or ano sa palagay nyo. Minsan and I'm teaching teachers po so you would think parang madali na lang sa kanilang gawin yun, pero hindi rin. Bakit? Hindi dahil hindi sila matalino or hindi sila magaling. Definitely, I don't believe na dahil wala silang opinion. Pero sa palagay ko kasi hindi sila lumaki or nasanay sa ganong klase ng kultura. Kaya din siguro po katulad na nabanggit ko, ako mismo as a student, in the past, I was more of the timid kind of student than the sharer kind. So palagay ko dahil yun sa hindi nga kasi tayo communities of inquiry sa mga schools natin, generally speaking. So how do you increase interest or develop student interest? There are so many ways to do that. But in the context of the community of inquiry, once they know that what we're going to talk about is what you want to talk about, while, of course, connected sa ating content, interesting na po yun sa kanila. Okay? At least in my experience, that's what happens. And that's what literature says. From Hazel Panganiban Fabricante, one problem I always faced when doing this community of inquiry is that we only have limited time for the students to speak well their insights, especially if their topic seems very interesting to them. Yes, opo. All of the students want to speak up their ideas. How can I manage it? Okay, ang time po talaga ay isang variable na hindi natin kontrolado, to a great extent. Unang-una, ang bawat subject matter meron lang talagang oras. For example, in my case, I teach for an hour and a half, para pong itong ganitong duration natin. May content po kaming pinag-usapan at we also engage in dialogue. And it's a usual feedback that the time is not enough. Okay, so kahit po marami na kayong na-cover, I think it's a good sign, okay, that students, complain, kulang yung time. Sana mas marami pang oras para mas mapag-usapan pa and so on and so forth. I think that's a good sign and I take it as a good sign. The thing is, siguro kung may magagawa tayo internally sa ating curriculum or sa ating school para mas ma-extend siguro yung oras, like for example, in a week, meron tayong a specific day for a community of inquiry and we can devote a greater time for it, that would be good. Pero kung hindi po talaga, I think minimum of 30 minutes is, if that's the only thing that we can have, parang pwede naman po yun. I think that can be fruitful as well. Anyway, parang about an hour and a half for older students is already too long naman. So 30 minutes to an hour is doable already. So kung halimbawa pong yung sinasabi po ni ma'am na palaging kulang yung oras, maganda po, mas gusto ko po siyang tingnan in a positive way. Okay? Kesa naman po, ang daming natitirang oras kasi talagang wala nang gustong magsalita. Isa po sigurong tip na pwede kong ibigay sa inyo is we try to draw out as much idea as possible, and part of the training, yun pong explicitly sinasabi natin sa mga estudyante is that they try to express their ideas as concisely as possible. Okay? So halimbawa po, tuturuan din natin sila na, as much as possible to get to the point. Okay? Kasi po, minsan, pag napapakwento na, sayang po yung oras. Okay naman sana yon. Kaya lang kung talaga pong may concern tayo sa time, then we will have to, control it as much as we can. Okay, from Chinchin de Ocampo, how will we engage students to collaborate effectively? How will we engage students to collaborate effectively? Like I mentioned po, ang dami pong paraan. Unang-una po, siguro magsasimula nga tayo sa sarili natin. I'm not sure my students themselves should be the best people to talk about it. Pero siguro po as a teacher, ang maganda pong gawin, tayo mismo, we emanate a certain kind of energy where welcoming tayo sa kanila, nakikita nila na open tayo, nakausapin sila. I think it all begins there. That's very important. Minsan meron ding konting pagiging firm na talagang we're encouraging them, urging them really to speak up. And then later on, kapag talagang naging interesado na rin sila sa topic, meron pong magsasalita. Okay, so I mentioned all those processes that typically takes place in the community of inquiry. And a lot of it is dependent really on how we facilitate. So all of those things are good answers to Ms. Chinchin's question of how we will engage students to collaborate effectively. I think a good follow-up question to Ms. Chinchin's question is, how do we now know that we are in fact allowing them to engage in collaboration effectively? Kasi pwede nating i-assume, hindi pa po, pero hindi pa naman pala collaboration. So maganda pong tingnan yung types of verbal exchanges na nabanggit ko kanina. The last question is from Leverier Arellano. How could we assess the participation of the students, most especially in the new normal context? It's a good question. Assessment as in evaluation, para pong ganun, assessment and evaluation. Okay. The community of inquiry, let me put it out there, is not easy to assess. Okay. Why? Because the skills, the socio-emotional skills, the critical thinking skills that are utilized by the students are not always observable. Take into account, for example, students who participate by listening intently rather than speaking all the time. Hindi po yun nakikita palagi. Okay? Pangalawa, kahit po nagsasalita ng madalas, minsan nakikita natin na hindi reflective masyado ang kanilang sinasabi. So, depende po yun sa ating criteria. Depende po yun sa ating standards. Ano bang priority natin? Gusto ba natin silang mag-grade for their participation? So, i-require natin silang magsalita? The problem there is, kanina lang din po na nabanggit ko, mahirap pong gawin yun because it's a spontaneous exercise. It's an organic exercise that's not going to become organic anymore if students feel like they have to contribute for the sake of a grade. So if we're talking about grading them because of it, there are ways to do that. For example, we can talk about how to identify lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills in a community of inquiry. Halimbawa lang po and then there are corresponding grades for it kung talaga pong kailangan natin siyang i-grade. Pero kung halimbawang tayo as teachers just assessing for the purpose of knowing where we're at as a community now, again, I will direct you to the types of verbal exchanges that I discussed earlier. Doon po natin ma-assess kung nagde-develop na po. Okay? So in my case, I don't do assessment as in per student, per dialogue. I no longer do that. So my way to evaluate would be papers. So I'm very careful when I construct my final paper questions. For example, again, I teach college students and master students. So one of their major requirements is a final paper. I often construct questions based on what we've talked about in the dialogue. So part of the criteria when I grade them, which I communicate to them also. And by the way, I'm I think I'm known for giving back my students' papers with comments and with the breakdown of their grades depending on the criteria. Part of the criteria is how reflective they are when they answer the guide questions, how comprehensive and how logical, for example, the way that they answer questions that I've prepared for them, and how they expand the discussion for a well thought out paper. So yun po, nililink ko yon sa kung paano sila nag-participate sa klase. So nakikita ko nga, kadalasan po, na kahit hindi naman palaging nagsasalita ang mga estudyante, they can also be quite reflective as those that often, that more, that as reflective, as those that more often speaks than them. Ganyan po. Okay, so I think that's the last question for today. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me. I hope you learned a significant amount. I hope to see you again in the future. And I hope you learned a lot from me. Thank you so much po.